Okay. The last word from you, a very quick word from you, that what can be done to improve the functioning of the parliament committee system.
ठीक से हुआ नहीं है ये।
That can be done is to
नहीं देखो ना ठीक नहीं है ये।
24.
यहाँ पे देखो ऐसे कट रहा है इधर कट रहा है।
Many of them are overlapping. So if one can kind of streamline it, and that will also reduce the cost of conducting these meetings, and make the system much more accountable and participatory.
Thank you very much. Several suggestions have come. I'm sure that the political class listens to some of the suggestions given by you. Maybe could be considered to ensure that this parliamentary committee system can be made into a much more efficient and better system. Thank you very much for joining me on this program. Thank you. There is little doubt that parliamentary committees have increased the efficiency and expertise of parliament. The volume of work before parliament has increased and often time is limited. We discussed today how a substantial part of parliamentary work is done by parliamentary committees. The committee reports enable informed debate in parliament. We hope you have been able to gain an insight into the parliamentary committee system. Do write to us and give us your feedback on this program. Our email ID is historylstv@gmail.com. We will return next week. There will be another page from history and another panel of experts. Till then, goodbye.
Today we focus on the outcome of the 8th G20 summit, which was recently concluded in St. Petersburg in Russia. The summit came at a time when there are clear divisions between emerging economies and the US over the Federal Reserve's winding down of stimulus and a slowdown of the Indian economy as well as those of other emerging economies. Of the G20 summit, we are joined in our studios by two distinguished guests. Please welcome Dr. Ramupendra Das, who is a senior fellow in the Research and Information Systems of the Ministry of External Affairs. Welcome to Insight, Dr. Das. And we are also joined by Dr. Wael Awad, who is a senior journalist. Welcome to Insight, Dr. Awad. And later in the program, we'll be joined by Dr. Amirullah Khan, who is a noted economist. Dr. Das, I'd like to begin with you. We understand the G20 summit, the G20 grouping, it came together after the 2008 crisis. But what is the role that this grouping has played in the world economy?
Obviously, the immediate response of the countries of the world was to the 2008 financial crisis.
Right.
Not that the issues of coordination and global governance were not looked at earlier prior to 2008, but the immediate trigger was 2008. And therefore, if you ask me one single thing which is the mainstay of G20 leaders is global governance.
All right.
Now, global governance can range from financial institutions, international financial infrastructure that we have, to climate change negotiations, in between the Doha round of WTO negotiations, of trade negotiations.
Right.
Alongside this, the mandate also has included the restructuring of the Bretton Woods institutions like World Bank and IMF, prudential norms for banking systems, the Basel III norms and its implementation. There was a Financial Stability Board that was constituted, precisely for the surveillance governance of the financial institutions, including banking supervision. Then there have been issues like corruption, money laundering, tax evasion, and issues of tax havens. So if you put all these together, and we will come to the St. Petersburg summit agenda in a while,
right.
I would see this as a pointer to two things. One is that the countries of the world have realized that you cannot leave global economic governance to some institutions. It is very important to have a regular summit, and therefore I would say that the very fact that the crisis was used as an opportunity to do this is one of the major gains, I would say. But yes, the road is long, which has to be traveled. Second important thing is inclusion of India into the global discourse as far as economic matters are concerned. Earlier it used to be always G8 which used to call the shots as far as determining the global course of economic dynamism or lack of it. And now with India's inclusion along with other emerging economies in the broad decision-making process of G20 is the second thing from our national point of view that I would like to highlight. So I think these are the two things at this stage I would like to mention.
Okay, so you're saying there were, of course, key takeaways for India as well from this G20 summit. We'll discuss those as well, and whether or not it has been able to restore that faith in multilateral mechanisms when it comes to regulating the global economy. But Dr. Awad, what would be the key takeaways for you from this particular summit? We understand it was completely overshadowed by the US drive to strike Syria.
Well, absolutely. I think what Dr. Das said, it was a very important summit. That's what prompted the American president himself to travel all this way, despite the fact that he cancelled the summit between him and Putin. But it was the Syrian crisis that had been forced itself on the agenda as a top priority. And that makes sure that it tell us also the amount of pressures and tension in the new international order, rather than really the Syrian crisis. Because here you have an international community trying to sustain the economic growth in the world, trying to stabilize it, and trying to ensure that there is an e-governing body that it can ensure the sustainability and the growth, whether it is India, whether it is China, which is leading the world economy for this decade. So therefore, to have a kind of order. So Syria forced itself on the agenda, not because of the American and Russian difference in the issue, but it has shown to a large extent that the instability in the Middle East will have a great impact, especially in the oil prices.
Absolutely.
Despite the fact that maybe people think that Russia is gaining from a short term gaining on this, but here it is. It's not that China, it's sticking to the principle of sustainability and a growth that should be remain in the world in a manner that you should not, you should have a more vision of how to lead the world as an emerging superpower, or as a superpower, Russia on its own, along with the American and the other superpower in the region. So therefore, I think Syria has forced itself definitely on the agenda, and we expected, and the outcome was very much showing the differences between those who try to sell a war and those who are defending the international order.
Right, and it did expose the deep divisions that exist between Russia and the US on this issue. But as you said, this is something that is bound to have implications not just for the region but for the world economy as well. It will push up oil prices for sure. Dr. Das, this was also part of the action plan that had come out at the end of the summit. The G20 nations, stressed upon avoiding policies that could cause global recovery to falter. And any such strike or any such development in that part of the world, Syria and the Middle East, is bound to have implications for us as well.
Exactly, because the region is a major part of the OPEC bloc, and most of the developing countries, the major ones, are net importers of the products produced by that region. It has to have a very decisive impact on the economic recovery, especially when most of the countries are grappling with tapering off of growth, and other domestic issues. I think it was another positive outcome of the G20 summit where non-economic issues and their linkages with the economic trajectories of the global economic trajectories were taken cognizance of, and therefore I would definitely consider this to be a highlight which is often not looked at, because usually G20 hawks limelight in terms of international financial system and related issues. But this is, in this summit, I would definitely consider this to be an important dimension where the linkages between non-economic and economic were actually taken note of.
Absolutely. In fact, in the whole run-up to the G20 summit, we saw how it was supposed to be about the world economy, but it was overshadowed by deep divisions that existed among the G20 members on how to respond to the developments in Syria. But speaking about India now, what do you think would be the key takeaways for us?
If you see Indian intervention during the summit, you would realize that number one, our Prime Minister demanded from the developed world, especially the US, that any tapering of the fiscal stimulus that they are envisaging, we should have clarity, and it should be done with certain degree of transparency, so that there is some advanced signals already sent to some of the emerging economies because of the stimulus. The capital had flowed into emerging economies, and just the reverse of that also was creating the reversal of capital inflows. And therefore, because of this interdependence between developed world's fiscal policy or monetary policy, both combined, on developing countries like India, it was very vehemently emphasized by our Prime Minister that we need to have some kind of advance notice so that we have the ability and time to adjust to any unfolding situation. Yes, we are aware that the imperatives of the developed nations in terms of handling their monetary policy would be determined by their domestic issues and concerns. But at the same time, it was very important to highlight that it has wider international implications, and that has at least come out in the G20 declaration that yes, you have some very advanced signals that by the end of the year the US Fed would like to taper off, but they are going to meet this month.
Right. Dr. Das, we'll discuss in greater detail what the US, this whole winding down of fiscal stimulus is all about, and how an advance notice can actually help economies such as India to prepare for withdrawal of funds when we return from this short break. Stay with us.
घर परिवार सामान कारोबार या सेहत अपनों की समंदर पार, कहीं भी कभी भी इंश्योर करवाए, ओरिएंटल का ऑनलाइन इंश्योरेंस अपनाए।
खुशियों का इंस्टेंट इंश्योरेंस, लॉग ऑन टू www.orientalinsurance.org.in।
पेश है मैक 14X आधुनिक सिंथेटिक टेक्नोलॉजी के साथ अधिकतम आरामदायक सवारी, अधिकतम पावर, पर्यावरण हितैषी इंजन की लंबी उम्र। मैक 14X आधुनिक सिंथेटिक टेक्नोलॉजी के साथ भारत पेट्रोलियम की ओर से।
हाँ? आप कुछ भूल रही हो क्या? भूल रही हो? आपने नल नहीं बंद किया। अरे ध्रुव, क्या दीदी? तुम कुछ भूल गए क्या दीदी? तुमने जाने से पहले लाइट नहीं ऑफ की।
उतना ही इस्तेमाल करें जितने की आवश्यकता है, आने वाली पीढ़ी को उनकी सुविधाओं से वंचित न करें।
सपनों के घर बसाने की हिचकिचाहट को अब छुट्टी कीजिए। इलाहाबाद बैंक आशियाना होम लोन्स। समय है सेलिब्रेशन का।
इस वक्त
उन्होंने मुझे बहुत पीटा माँ, मैं किसी तरह जान बचा कर आ गई।
महिलाओं पर किसी भी प्रकार की घरेलू हिंसा कानूनी अपराध है।
अपनी सुरक्षा के लिए मुझे क्या करना चाहिए?
प्रोटेक्शन ऑफ विमेन फ्रॉम डोमेस्टिक वायलेंस एक्ट 2005 के अनुसार महिलाओं पर शारीरिक और मानसिक उत्पीड़न कानूनी अपराध है। पीड़ित महिला नजदीकी पुलिस स्टेशन पर संपर्क कर सकती है।
नीचे।
काकी, घर में शौचालय कहाँ है? बहू को घर में कहाँ, खुले में ही जाना पड़ेगा। फिर तो तुम घूंघट भी खोल ही दो। एक तरफ तो आपको बहू का घूंघट भी सरकाना गवारा नहीं, और दूसरी तरफ उससे खुले में। इस तरह तो हमने कभी सोचा ही नहीं था। तो अब सोचो, घर में शौचालय बनवाओ और इस्तेमाल करो।
शुरू करें निर्मल भारत अब।
जहाँ सोच वहाँ शौचालय।
शामी, देखो फिर आ रहा है। मैं टीवी मांगेगा, मैं निकलता हूँ तो टाल दियो।
जरा रुकिए।
हाँ बोलिए।
ये देखिए कंज्यूमर कोर्ट का फैसला।
ये कागज किसी और को दिखाना, इससे कुछ नहीं होगा।
आप जरूर होगा। अदालत का आदेश न मानने पर तुम्हारे खिलाफ वारंट जारी हो सकता है।
तो क्या?
तो तुम्हें 3 वर्ष तक का कारावास या 10,000 रुपए तक का जुर्माना या दोनों हो सकते हैं। समझे?
समझ गया।
जागो ग्राहक जागो।
नई बहू तो बहुत खूबसूरत है। मेरी पसंद जो है। अरे मेरी बहू तो दुनिया भर का सामान लेकर आई है। तुम कौन सा धन लेकर आई हो मेरी बहू? मेरी बहू लेकर आई है शिक्षा, प्रतिभा और काबिलियत।
जी माँ, दहेज वो लोग लेते हैं जो लोभी हैं, कायर हैं।
दहेज लेकर खुद को छोटा मत कीजिए। शान से कहिए, हमें दहेज नहीं चाहिए।
हमें दहेज नहीं चाहिए।
Welcome back to Insight. We are discussing the outcome of the recently concluded G20 summit. Right now in the program, we are joined by Dr. Amirullah Khan, who is a noted economist. Welcome to Insight, Dr. Khan. We were discussing the relevance of the G20 grouping, and we know how it had achieved unprecedented cooperation between the developed world and the emerging economies to stave off the 2009 economic crisis. Do you think it has been able to address the concerns of emerging economies this time around too?
I think that's been the biggest takeaway from the Russian meet. In that it was clear that almost everybody who was attending was conscious of the fact that there is a problem. That in itself was the big achievement. That it agreed that any measure that is taken is not taken only from a domestic standpoint, but will include emerging economies. That any measure that is taken will be announced and categorically defined much in advance is in itself a departure from a worldview which believed that I will do what is best for me. And that I think is significant. It is also significant that this happened in Russia, where much of the crisis exists right now.
Right.
And therefore I think that when we look at the overall achievement of the G20, given the turmoil that exists in the world right now, is pretty significant.
Since you speak about turmoil, we know that this was supposed to be about money and economy, but it was completely overshadowed by the developments in Syria. It also exposed deep divisions that exist between the G20 members on how to respond to the events there.
Yeah, Anurag, that's the ticklish issue. Syria remains a serious problem for the world community, and because of the kind of problem that exists within the country, it's very difficult for anyone to say what's the right way out. And therefore it is understandable that when the entire world met there, it was fumbling for an answer. Right. Russia is looking to handle it in one way, the US is obviously looking at it differently. England and France are quite opposed on how they look at Syria. India's historic position on Syria has been pretty clear, but given the circumstances, it finds that it is mediating in a world that is worried about not just Syria but about the region and the impact that this entire issue will have on crude oil prices or exchange rates. That's why it is a bit complicated and not surprising that Syria took center stage.
But Dr. Awad, this could have been an ideal time for the world community to discuss this issue at length, the pros and cons, the situation in Syria, but that clearly did not happen, although that was the elephant in the room.
Well, because the United States, UK, and despite the fact that UK Parliament is rejecting, but David Cameron being there himself, the Prime Minister, and including the French also, and Saudi Arabia, Turkey, these are the main warmongering people who wanted to go for a war. So they were trying to campaign or garner more support for their own agenda rather than really going for finding a solution. The situation in Syria for the last 30 months for this country is a regime change. So a regime change by means of an inside internal conflict or by means of using external forces. Now when they failed to achieve that internally for the last 30 months, despite the fact that they had their own mercenaries from more than 30 countries, yet they are failing to do it externally because they realized it's not Libya anymore. You can't take us for a ride like you did in Iraq. You said we have one for weapon of mass destruction, and then you apologize, you said there's no weapon, and again now you're taking us to Libya and you said this is only a limited strike and it is under the UN sanction, and then we realized the Vice President John Biden, when he go to Russia and threatening them that it will be the oil or the gas to the European or the CIS country, issues that they have raised and blackmailed Russia, where Russia have agreed for the UN Security Council resolution on this, and they realized that these countries went beyond. Even according to Berlusconi, the Prime Minister of Italy, he said himself that France started attacking Libya even before the mandate of the UN Security Council, even before the NATO forces took place. So if you are not telling us what is your hidden agenda from attacking, then therefore there has to be an international order, there has to be a body in this world that can really govern and avoid wars. And by the time you're creating a war in Syria, it's not going to be limited strike. That is what they are trying to sell the story. It is not limited because geographically you are not limited. You may be in the most important vital geopolitical region where you are having at stake Turkey, Israel, Jordan, then you are having Iraq, then you have Iran, where the oil would be badly adversely affected if a war breaks, because none of these allies of Syria will stay quiet. And they have already shown, if you follow the last week events where we noticed what the Israeli fired two ballistic missiles, it was within a minute that ballistic missile notice was given to Syria that these missiles were launched by the Israelis, and then immediately the Syrian and the Iranian got ready. Even they moved their launchers for the ballistic missile. It means that even that's why they made it fall in the sea, the Israelis. They intentionally did it, and the turbulent water they're saying that we are doing testing. It's not a testing. It was testing your own strength, whether you are in a position to defend or no. So then when they realize it is an all-out war, then they have even the United States President himself taking it to the Congress, realizing that he cannot sell for a limited strike. He is looking for a more regional war in the region. I think these are the issues where the American administration and the government of the United States has to come openly, like the French, they have to come openly. It's not like what we get from the news that it is Saudi Arabia who paid $5 billion a deal, a contract to 5 years, that if you strike Holland, you strike Syria, then the deal go through. So it's not buying. We are not here trying to rent an army to go and attack a nation. It is the whole world is at stake, because it's not going to be a Syria US war, it's going to be a regional, and it also, according to resources, it could be more for a third world war.
Okay, so you're saying there is a possibility that it will suck in other countries of the region. It will be a full-blown regional conflict which will have implications for the oil economy. Dr. Das, before going into the break, we were talking about differences between emerging economies and the US over this quantitative easing of Federal Reserve program. If you could tell us more about it. We do know that it started off in the year 2008 when there was this global economic crisis going on, and the US Fed had introduced this stimulus program to help the US economy. What was its impact globally, and what will be the implications once they start tapering it off?
See, the 2008 crisis which originated in the US was essentially because of the collapse of their, private sector, banking, real estate, all the bubbles that bursted. It landed their economy into a liquidity crunch and liquidity crisis. So what US did was, it actually tried to inject liquidity into the system by buying the US bonds. So with that buying, a lot of fiscal stimulus was provided to the US system.
Okay.
Now, what happens when you have liquidity in your economy, like it happened in the US? The capital flows in a manner that it reaches a destination where it gets the highest return. Incidentally, if you see the inter-country interest differentials, you would realize that interest rates in emerging economies and including India were attractive enough for that injected additional capital into the US system to fly and come and get parked in India.
And that's what happened.
And that's what happened. Because India was still growing, we had mitigated the impact of global economic crisis. We were having fairly good growth rate next to just only China. And our rate of interest regime was such that capital found it to be profitable to come to our economy. Now, when in recent times the US Fed started giving the hints that they may withdraw the quantitative easing, which means they would like to again sell the US bonds and inject out or suck out the excess liquidity in the US system.
Right.
Then on the fears that there will be a liquidity crisis in the private sector in the US, the private capital started flowing out of the emerging economies. Recently, because the US economy was also doing a little better in terms of its growth prospects, and the interest rates there also were such that this also facilitated capital flow out of emerging economies, and therefore we had faced a situation of dollar shortage, and the price of dollar went, which meant the price of rupee went down vis-a-vis dollars, and that's how we have been depreciating. And the Prime Minister was very straightforward in highlighting this in the G20 summit, that if such a thing you have to do, if we have an advance signal, at least we will be able to adjust. And let me bring to your kind attention one of the moves that was on the sidelines of the G20 summit to mitigate such impact of quantitative easing when we felt that none of our measures are actually helping the arrest of rupee depreciation. The conscious effort as part of the BRICS Development Bank was then materialized during the sidelines of the G20 when the country said that around $100 billion of credit reserve facilities will be created with different contributions from the BRICS country to mitigate such external financial shocks as the one that you just mentioned.
Of course, we'll discuss that particular move also in greater detail. But Dr. Khan, the most telling impact of the impending US tapering of quantitative easing has been felt in India. Although the rupee is not the only currency which is battling a slowdown, but we are facing a decade-low growth. The rupee is in the state of a free fall. It is the worst performing currency in Asia. What do you think will be the fallout of it all? Is it going to get worse when it actually happens?
Well, that's the key question. Now, what's happened clearly is that the moment this signal came out, the dollar started flowing away, and therefore, as Dr. Das says, we have this currency crisis, and we have huge amounts of foreign investment going back. But I think that is it. There is nothing more there. If you see what's happened in the last week or so, you find that nothing's changed as far as the United States is concerned. But the Sensex is back in action. It is moved up. The rupee has become firmer. So there is a certain understanding that we must have that India's economy, though very heavily exposed now than it was 20 years ago, is still fundamentally strong on its domestic footprint.
Many are crediting the new RBI governor.
Yeah, I think he should take the credit right now because he will have to take a lot of the blame later on if things don't go well. But that's good enough. The fact that he came very well prepared, the fact that he knew exactly what he was saying, and that it immediately resulted in a substantial improvement shows that be the G20 as it may, be the US economy as it might be, there is a certain domestic standpoint that India has and a strength that India has, that it's able to overcome these problems. Yes, the rupee fell and fell dramatically, fell more than what almost as bad as Indonesia, as Russia, as China, as South Africa. But we must also realize that the rupee has been overvalued for quite a while. This correction had to happen.
Okay.
It is indeed interesting that all of it happened together. And I'm saying interesting very, very carefully because there can be various cause and effect factors. But it is that it happened together, and therefore it's certain that as things improve, then all this improves. I think the biggest gains that we have from the G20, which I hope people notice, is the focus on infrastructure. That's a big thing that has happened. It has allowed us to get back within India to think on infrastructure again. Because that's where the crux lies. That's where this jump from 5% to 8% growth rate will happen and will come from.
And they did recognize India's latest efforts to spur infrastructure projects. On that note, we have to take a break in the program. Stay with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Insight. We are discussing the outcome of G20 summit. This summit, do you think this has been able to restore the confidence of the world in multilateral mechanisms when it comes to regulating the world economy, when it comes to global economic growth and development? Or do you think the contrary has happened and multilateralism is not working because the major powers, US and Russia, are not on the same page anymore?
No, I think they are on the same page in many ways. Not only just politically, how do you deal with the crisis you create, This is the problem, is that you create a crisis, the United States create the crisis and ask the world to manage the crisis. Here as a country, we're telling you, do not create a crisis. Let us focus more on the economy. And I think our colleagues here have already focused on the exact advantage and the outcome of the summit. It is very important to have a multilateral approach to the crisis. It's a global crisis, nothing one one country. It's everybody is affected.
Right.
And it is, after all, at the end of the day, whether it's in a conflict, whether it is economic growth, whether it's an intrinsic or intrinsic kind of a growth in any country, it has to have an impact on the economy, the global economy. And I think that is the social angle to it is also fueling the unrest all over the world. Because unless and until you start having a kind of an intrinsic kind of a growth economically, you cannot face, because the music is coming from all over the world. The United States is at a national debt. They have $17 trillion to pay. They are unable to. So there is a kind of domestic unrest even inside the United States, including the Fed and big bank fraud which has come to the pictures, including many of the issues. Europe is in a bankruptcy also, and it's falling. Therefore, if we look at the conflicting zone in the world, it's only giving the arm industry which is flourishing. Yet, when you are sitting on a multiple platform, you need the rest of the country to be together on one platform, and let us share and let us find a solution for a long, making the economic, global world order in place and in order. And I think that is the main achievement of this 20, and the importance of it. That has to be met, and they should meet very much annually. Not only, it is very important because the crisis is becoming more and more, and we are seeing more social unrest all over the world. So unless and until we have somebody to put a control system to control this, then we are not heading for a stable world. That's my reading. I don't know.
Okay, Dr. Das, do you think multilateral groupings like the G20 are still relevant?
Yes, when we say G20, many who are not part of G20, obviously for very valid reasons felt that this grouping is not going to do anything, but it is going to be functioning on the same lines as G8 used to function. So G8 has become G20. But over the years, it has been realized now by other parts of the world, other countries of the world, that even if they are not part of the G20 by direct membership, the very fact that Brazil is there, there is something which Brazil brings to the table of G20, which is a Latin American perspective.
Right.
South Africa joining BRIC brings African perspective. India, has always championed the cause of underdeveloped, smaller developing countries, historically. And India and China, both from, and Indonesia, from Asian countries, we cover South Asia, Southeast Asia, East Asia as well. So I think, there is a fundamental difference between G20 and G8 and G20. That is why it becomes very relevant. What is still missing in my view is there is no institutionalized dialogue process between, say, Brazil and Latin American countries, India and South Asian countries, China and other Southeast Asian countries, Indonesia, South Africa. I think if we can institute a process which actually feeds into the G20 process via the BRICS nations or some of the other developing countries, as I mentioned, like Indonesia, I think this forum is going to make a dent in terms of global governance at large, and more importantly, global economic governance.
Okay, but we were talking about the rupee depreciation and the impending quantitative easing. What implications do you think it will have for us once that happens? Because one signal that was pretty clear from the G20 summit was that this is going to happen and the emerging economies will have to set their own house in order.
Yes. Now, the tenor of G20 meeting outcome is that emerging economies should, put their house in order, because developed countries are going to put their house in order. Fine. I mean, I think that is quite all right, and therefore, I think our engagements with a smaller set of G20 countries, as I mentioned, BRICS, and our cooperation in financial and development, arenas would hold us emerging economies in very good step. To say that we will be able to mitigate the effects of quantitative easing of the US completely would be very wrong to comprehend at this stage, because we are going to get affected, and perhaps if it is end of the year, we need to scale up our efforts to adjust to that new economic reality. But at the same time, I have a very strong feeling that even if what US Fed does by the end of this year, the measures already taken by the government and RBI in recent times, they are going to show the outcomes that time, and possibly that is going to have positive implications for growth and other infrastructural needs, and the capital, as much as it had to flow, would not flow any further. Perhaps there will be a reversal of outflow into inflows.
And we're also looking at a good agricultural
monsoon.
Thanks to a good monsoon, which will help ease food prices if things go as
so
planned.
Therefore, RBI will be much less engrossed with the stabilization of prices, as much becoming growth oriented.
Okay, Dr. Amirullah Khan, would you share his optimism?
Yes. What I'd like to add there is that significant point, which is that on multilateralism, there was the United Nations, so there is the United Nations, and given the UN framework, there was really no need for anything else. But then we had various multilateral institutions that came by, the WTO and G20 being the two of them, because the UN, for example, was not geared to handle a financial crisis.
And also, we've seen in times of a crisis, for instance, in the case of Syria especially, we've seen utter indifference to what the UN thinks.
Yeah, and that's one reason why we have these smaller clubs emerging. G20 is a small club. Out of 200 countries, 20 represented here. The UN in that sense was the democratic system where all 208 or whatever countries sat together. And therefore you will have countries like Nigeria, etc. complaining when you talk about the G20. So what does the G20 do? It brings the G8, developed countries, adds the 12 emerging economies. By the time they come together, there are 12 others who are emerging. So now you need to have a bigger club and so on. So therefore this issue will always be there. We will always leave out some people. It will never be a completely democratic functioning if it is a group of smaller countries. But the G20, what it did or what it has done in the last 14 or 15 years is to understand that the paradigm of financial flows in the world has changed. Today, the mobility of capital is such that every country needs to be aware of the fact that changes in any other geographies are going to impact it. For example, the financial sector and its fragmentation in Europe, it has a profound impact on what's happening in India, just as Dr. Das mentioned. And therefore, we need to know that, look, we have to be careful, we have to be aware. We can't just wait for somebody to give us the right signal and blame them for what is happening there. And secondly, to help our financial sector withstand all these problems. If we take a look at India and take an honest look at ourselves, we have done very little as far as our financial sector is concerned. After such a great time, we passed that pensions bill yesterday. We still haven't done anything much with banking laws. We still are far from being financially inclusive. And if we have all that mess, then what a G20 and its emphasis on financial sector does is that it pushes us on to sign on to international conventions and correct our own situation. And therefore be better prepared to handle anything that happens around the world. See, the fact is that with an open, liberalized, globalized world, financial flows are going to happen. They are going to be hostage to events that are outside the economic framework like Syria. They are going to be hostage to things that happen domestically in the United States and in China. And therefore it is in our interest to be as better prepared for these things as possible and not just lay the blame on things happening somewhere else in the world.
But Dr. Khan, there was also an agreement in the summit that central banks of developed countries will try to communicate more clearly as to when they are going to go about this policy correction. So early warnings like these are definitely going to help economies like India.
It's a great announcement of intention that I will, as early as I can, signal to the rest of the world. But it is intention, and finally, when push comes to shove, central banks will do what is in their favor, what will be good for them, and sometimes they will be able to give enough indication, and sometimes they will be able to give wrong indication. For example, in this whole scenario, what's happened? There has been nothing that the central bank has said. There is just our feeling that the central bank is indicating that there will be some tightening, right? And that itself is enough to spur a number of changes. So therefore, we should take it as it stands, that it is an articulation of an intention to do well and to act responsibly for the rest of the world when faced with a domestic issue. This is a huge issue. It's a very complicated issue, and it will not always happen. Greece will do what it wants to do, France will do what it has to do, and the US will do what it has to do, given what
So it's up to individual countries to set their own house
in order and be prepared that investment flows are so very dynamic. There is really no cost to flows. Transferring monies is as easy as
the economy is becoming more and more integrated. Right, well, with that we have to take a break in the program. Stay with us. We'll be back with the final segment of the show.
लोकल यूनिवर्सिटी कहाँ है भाई? लोकल यूनिवर्सिटी सहारनपुर में तो उसके प्रेसिडेंट क्या है? प्रेसिडेंट का मतलब प्रेसिडेंट तो अमेरिका वाले होते हैं यूनिवर्सिटी के, वाइस चांसलर तो होते हैं। अमेरिका में तो वाइस चांसलर तो प्रेसिडेंट ही होते हैं, तो इसे यहाँ बना दिया। उसी पैटर्न बना दिया।
Welcome back to Insight. We are discussing the outcome of the recently concluded G20 summit. you mentioned earlier in the program how, the main takeaway for India came from the sidelines, the decision of Japan to lend us $50 billion in case of need, and also the BRICS countries finalizing their emergency financing facility of $100 billion. India being able to access such funds, do you think that is going to restore confidence? Because we've been suffering from this lack of confidence by investors globally and domestically in the India story.
Yes, it's a very major step. One, as you mentioned, increasing the swap arrangement with Japan from $15 billion to $50 billion, whereby, if we export to Japan, we will accept Japanese yen, and when we import from Japan, we will be paying in Indian rupees. So that's a huge, mitigating effect. Because if you see the current account deficit hovering around $80 billion, and if we have a facility of almost $50 billion of a swap agreement with Japan, a major trading partner. Second is we are also contributing to this contingency, cash reserve facility of BRICS with $100 billion divided as 41 billion contributed by China and 18 billion each by India, Russia and Brazil, and $5 billion by South Africa. But it is definitely, as you very rightly said, it is going to restore investors' confidence, because now we can say very safely that even if we do not have reversal of inflows from the US, we have sufficient funds to mitigate the immediate impact of dollar shortage. That is their confidence. I'm not saying that it is going to solve all the problems, but at least we can project by saying that here there are countries emerging. The combined foreign exchange reserves of BRICS countries is $4.4 trillion US. And these countries, when they decide to do something, the world will listen. So as much as, today, we need the developed world, the situation has emerged where, the world requires to take cognizance of, the emerging economies like the BRICS. But I would not say that these were two important takeaways only on the sidelines of the summit. If I will just mention, and I will go back to the point which Dr. Khan was mentioning earlier about the democratic process of UN as opposed to G20, that process. It is in G20 that there has been a conscious effort made to improve the voice of the developing world at large in global financial institutions. So for instance, there was the fourth quota review of IMF where the voting rights of the developing world have been increased. The share has been increased. Now, this is it has not been ratified. We were looking for for ratification, but it will be done by January 2014, which is the deadline. Right. So, G20 may be 20 countries, but it is impacting in terms of democratizing global financial institutions. Right. So in that sense, yes, G20 may not represent the entire world, but if it can influence some of the major institutions of, say finance, for instance, where the share of or the voice of developing world increases, I think that is nothing but a pointer to the fact that the democratization of financial institutions is underway.
More inclusive.
Second thing is G20 is often perceived as a forum where finance is discussed, or that is of paramount importance. A major intervention was in terms of freer flow of skilled professionals, internationally. And in fact, our Prime Minister highlighted that, and he said that especially creating jobs for youth, alongside having growth outcomes globally. Now the developed world is going to face skill shortage, and these are the emerging economies, especially India, which is going to feel that. So I think we need to see these two major factors of production mobility, both capital and labor, as far as the takeaways for India, also from the G20 process as much as from the sidelines, as we just mentioned.
Absolutely. Dr. Awad, that's a significant development, this whole action plan to boost not just recovery but to increase jobs.
I think you see that the transitional power in the 21st century as has been presented, it shows also that the productive populations is very important to playing the major role in any kind of economic growth. If you look at at the G20 composition, you will find India, you will find China, you will find Indonesia, you will find those countries which is the most populous nations and the most productive nations. So this will lead to an increase in the production. It will lead also in the increase in the middle class uplifting of the middle class, which they need the space of their own, which will increase the consumption and also increase the production. Here you are, you're looking for a new market as well. You will look access to a new market. You will have to sustain your oil security to secure it, to sustain the growth rate which you are putting as a target for the next 10 years. And I think it is here the link is missing, which we need to see the domestically to it, and also we should see the interest of the superpower. Are they really wanted these emerging power, or they call it the great power, emerging power, to really come to a stage where they can threaten their own interest? After all, it is the whole global order is based on economy, and it's a conflict of the economy and interest all over the world led us to many wars all over the region. I mean, look, the American and the West find it very easy, shortcut to go for a war, because that is the way they can put their agenda on the table. But other countries which sustain the democratic process, like in India or like in Indonesia now, trying to come up, these are the countries who keep on struggling. So unless and until we see these productive populations are in a position to stand the country on its own, then they will be having this say in the international community. This is my vision on this, because India can play this major role if India has really domestically were able to sustain this economy and made sure that this productive population is in a position to emerge and feel satisfactory with the growing emerging power, not in an unsatisfactory manner. Unsatisfactory manner will lead to what there is a plan for having an inter-conflict and also for interfighting between neighbors. And that is how we logically look at the wars between neighbors and look at it from looking for interest all over the world. I think the whole economic look should be seen from the interest of those nations, and let us put it across the table and see how the world can move forward in a global manner.
All right, Dr. Khan, you wanted to come in here?
No, I just was trying to react to Dr. Awad's complaint that we seem to be agreeing on everything, and therefore there is not much scope for debate. It's not just because of that, but the point that I would like to make here to both these gentlemen is that one of the issues that we need to now start consciously thinking about is that as financial flows move, as people move across the borders, so will global interests, and therefore this wisdom that sovereign countries have no business in interfering with other sovereign countries' domestic interests is going to get questioned time and again. Right now with Syria. Is it right for the United States to worry about gassing of civilian populations, or the accusation of gassing of civilians by the government? Is it right for the US to interfere in what happens in Gujarat? Is it right for Russians to think about what's happening with minorities in China? See what will happen, and this is something that the G20, the UN, not the WTO hopefully, but we'll have to grapple with, is that as interests move across borders, so will worries. So will the tendency to think about my investment in your country, and therefore if there is a threat to a democratic institution in that country, is it right for me to comment and to actively interfere? This, along with the entire responsibility that there should be no war. Now, who will handle these issues? Who will grapple with this really serious issue on one hand, that it is investments, technology and people moving into another country? Till we were autarkic countries, till we had nothing to do with each other, it was fine to say that it is not right to interfere. But what is happening?
20 dictators all over the world. Do we have to go for a conflict to bring democracy? There is an international order. Who is giving them the morality, the moral police to go and say A country is bad, B country is... Let us have an international order. Let's have a Security Council. Let the international take its own course. Why to give it the edge, and then at the end of the
the day after 10 years you say sorry, or you repent the attack, it wasn't meant.
Right, human rights violations are taking place in many countries.
I consider some debate going on, right? But you know, the point I'm making is, and I completely agree there, the point I'm making is that there is this debate. It's a difficult debate, but there is this debate that we have to
Absolutely, this is a never-ending debate. Dr. Khan, I'd like a quick word from you. There was, this agreement to curb protectionism within the G20 countries through the WTO. How significant is this extension of commitment towards, removal of trade barriers?
I think this is the most significant. As an economist, that's the most significant issue. What we've seen over the last 10 years is this very disturbing trend towards protectionism in the developed world. And it is disturbing because it goes against what we've been arguing. It is disturbing against what they've been asking people like us to do. Right. We have moved ahead. We are less protectionist. Now if protectionism comes back, then we are going back 100 years. And that is a very serious issue, and that we cannot allow.
Absolutely. On that note, it's time for me to wrap up the discussion here. We are completely out of time. I'd like to thank all my guests for coming to the studios. It was a pleasure having you all here. That's it for now in this edition of Insight. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.